is from Matthew chapter 2, verses 11 to 23. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, and of incense, and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I can tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod, and so was fulfilled that the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all of the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more." After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So fulfilled what was said through the prophets, he will be called a Nazarene. Amen.
Thanks, Heather. Morning, everyone. Yeah, thanks for being here. I'll tell you who you wouldn't have voted for, had you had the opportunity, which you didn't, which was Herod the Great, who is the king, who during the course, I don't know if you ever noticed, because this reading you'll hear every year, during the course of our reading, of course, dies and is replaced by one of his sons. You wouldn't have voted for him for lots and lots of reasons. He wasn't a very nice man. He had acquired a lot of power. He wasn't really the entitled king of Israel, but he was a favorite of the Romans. He was very ruthless, and in service to the empire of Rome, he had built up his own power base very effectively. He was passionate about his wife, Mariam, wooed her and so forth. But in the end, he thought she was plotting against him, which she doesn't seem to have been, so he had her killed. He had 3 of his sons killed for fear that they might try and overthrow him. So a guy who has his wife and 3 of his kids killed is not really very savory, is he? By any stretch of the imagination, you wouldn't like him. He's one of 3 Herods who features in the New Testament. So in this reading that we just had, thanks Heather for that, he is replaced by one of his surviving sons. Somebody once said of Herod the Great, "You're better off being his pig than his child," meaning you're more likely to survive. Anyway, he was replaced eventually, because at the time of the birth of Jesus, Herod was at least my age or older. So he was, particularly in Palestine at the time, elderly and really getting on. People didn't tend to live quite as long as we tend to try to live now. So he'd been on the throne a long period of time by then, 34, 35 or more years, I think. Can't quite remember. So he's getting to the end of his reign. And then there's his son, who we hear about there, who took over from him. And then as we go through the New Testament, come into the time of the Acts of the Apostles, his grandson is the next Herod. So right through the New Testament, you keep hearing about King Herod, but it's not the same guy each time, though none of them seem to have been particularly nice people. There are two occasions when Jesus was all new, and Herod appears at both occasions, and I would like to come to them. But first, I'd like to share with you a little... Oh, I'm going the wrong way, am I? Oh, no? There we go. A message to you from Prosy, which came via me on Friday, I think it was, or Thursday night, Friday, to say thank you. I share this at this point because I want to contrast you with Herod. You're such nice people. And Prosy wants you to know you're nice people. Now you might go, hang on, Prosy who? And I'm sorry if we've failed to communicate who Prosy is, but you supported her journey to Canada just over a year ago. Prosy is a member of the Luafu Church on the edges of Kampala, and you've just recently heard from Robin and Catherine about the needs at Luafu Church and the needs they're trying to meet with, particularly of children through the work of the school and so forth. So she's from that fellowship. By a long story that doesn't matter now, she was given the opportunity to study for a master's in theology at McGill University in Canada. And you and your friends at Cannington paid for her to get there. So thank you for doing that. Otherwise she'd have missed that amazing opportunity to come from her set of circumstances to a master's degree in a prestigious Canadian university is quite a story. Anyway, the thing is that she's not alone among the international students, but she appears to be alone in those who can't go home for Christmas. So she's from a culture where people are always together. We're from a culture where people do stuff alone a lot. In Prosy's culture, you don't do stuff alone. You're always together. You're always with family. You do stuff together. That's how it works. You cook together. You feed together. You do whatever you do, but it's always you're doing it together all the time. So it's quite difficult for her being in a Western culture, very similar to our own Canadian culture, where people are very individual and do stuff on their own a lot. And she finds herself to be, as far as we can tell, the only student remaining on campus over Christmas and so forth. And recognizing, still praying that won't happen, that she'll find a home to be in over Christmas. She did last year, and I hope and believe she will this year. But you sent her a present, or a collection of presents. If you didn't know anything about that, you still did actually, because we are a church. And therefore, if one of us does it, we do it. And if one of us does it in the name of Jesus, we particularly do it. And everything we do as the subjects of Jesus' reign, coming to that, is actually with everybody. So even if you'd never heard of her, you are actually part of this scene. And so here was her message to me. And I love the fact that it was on the very day that she was saying goodbye to the other international students heading home for Christmas, and knowing she alone would not be doing that. She doesn't have the money to return to Uganda. That she alone would not be with family and friends at Christmas time. She was really feeling it when your parcel arrived. And she opened it, and she was just bowled over. And she said some other things to me apart from those messages on the screen. But, she said, most of all, I thank Jesus, whose timing is always brilliant, because this was a very hard time for me. And on that hard day, your presence arrived to tell me I'm part of something and I'm cared about. And so I just wanted to share that, because that is you being what you're called to be. You see, I couldn't care less whether you were successful in passing exams. It has no particular meaning in eternity or whatever. I couldn't care less whether you had or are having a successful career. It's meaningless whether you're in the boardroom or the shop floor. It frankly doesn't make a difference to your humanity, to your worth, to your value in the sight of God, or to your eternity. It just doesn't matter a scrap. The things that people chase with such a passion are a complete waste of time and a sad use of human life. And what you're showing is that actually, not that we're all free of all those influences, because none of us are, but what you're showing is there's another influence in your life, a gorgeous influence in your life, your King. And his name is Jesus. And I love the fact that you're responding to him. You probably wouldn't be here this morning if you weren't. And you're making difference in his world and in the lives of other people and in lots and lots of ways, because he's your King. And so in Advent, thought it would be great to end up looking at the qualities of that King in the third Sunday of Advent. And I thought we could pick up with those words from the Magi who arrive at Herod's palace. And Herod's palace was quite a palace. He'd had it built himself to his own designs to celebrate his wealth and his power and privilege. He was quite a keen builder of things. I don't mean he built it himself. He just thought up the idea and made other people pay for it. It's really what happened. But anyway, he lived in this palace, and it was the obvious place for the Magi to go to, because they wanted to give their gifts, which they had brought, and bow the knee before the one whose star they had noticed and whom they knew as the King of the Jews. It's an interesting twist in the tale, in a sense, because at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, you have these people who've traveled a long way saying, "Where is the King of the Jews?" He's newborn. He's new. Well, there's another time when Jesus is new. And Herod, son of Herod, is not far away, and neither are those words at the time. The second time Jesus is all brand new is his resurrection. I don't know if you've ever noticed how similar Christmas and Easter are. Easter's about the resurrection of Jesus. It follows Good Friday, and it's the core of our faith. And who gets to find out first that Jesus is risen, but the women who nobody's willing to believe, people of low social status in their society. There's no fanfare, there's no big celebration, and people in powerful and special places are not told about it actually very much, except as hearsay and something they need to sit on, a message that they need to squash, which is so like the circumstances of Jesus' birth. The other time he was new at his resurrection, the first risen from the dead, and he's new at his birth. The first time and the only time that God has slipped into human skin and appeared among us. And he's all new. And who's told about it? Well, shepherds out in the fields, people who themselves could have been placed in mangers as kids. Not the sort of thing that happens to Herods, who are placed in the luxury nursery when they're born and so forth. And the circumstances are so similar. And I think we can learn a bit about who we are by discovering more about who our King is. And we can learn a bit about who our King is by maybe looking at those who gathered around his arrival in that first time that he was new, when he was born in Bethlehem. On both occasions, he is known as King of the Jews, because you may recall that when he was crucified, which is the necessary lead up to his resurrection, if you like, the necessary process before it, when he is crucified, the wise men get their answer. The charge which was nailed above his head read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." So it takes a whole Gospel of Matthew to get from the first time to the second time. And the point surely is that it doesn't matter at what point in the story you find yourself, the King of the Jews is under the hammer, under the ratchet, under the death sentence, under the rejection, under the cosh, in competition with the systems of power that are ruining our earth and spoiling the lives of people who live here, because we continue to pursue what is unsustainable, unhelpful, and hurts. And into the midst of this, God slips on human skin and says, "Guys, I can show you how to do this. Follow me. It can be done a great deal better." And the results are awesome, and they are called the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. And so Christmas is when we celebrate the birth of that king who is such a contrast to Herod. In fact, I've been pondering Matthew's gospel a little bit in preparation for this Christmas, and it seems to me that Matthew is eager to show us Herod as almost an opposite to Jesus, and Jesus as almost an opposite to Herod. I say almost an opposite because, actual fact, Herod chose for Jesus to be bad news to him. But Jesus could have been, should have been, and in a sense was, good news for Herod. Not good news for the power structure, not good news for the silly runaway wealth that he enjoyed, not news that it would encourage him to go on killing people for the sake of his own power, etc. But actually, the one born to be King of the Jews, whom the Magi visited, could have absolutely transformed Herod's life in his old age. And at the last, he could have found real purpose, real worth, and something we call salvation. So let's have a quick contrast thing between Herod and those who gather around the birth of Jesus. And we'll start with the Magi and just see how different they are to the king in the palace where they first turn up looking for the King of the Jews. It is, after all, reasonable to think that if you're gone looking for somebody called the King of the Jews, you would go to the palace which is owned by the king who's ruling over the Jews. That's a sensible place to go looking. But of course, he's not there. For the Magi, the wise men, the kings of our Christmas cards, what matters to them is the truth. We've seen a sign, and according to our search for the truth, According to what we value most, this sign indicates to us the birth of that king who fulfills all that kings are supposed to be. We know he's going to come out of the Jewish nation, and according to our search, it looks like he might have arrived. You see, when you put together your contribution to the gift for Prosy, or the Christmas tree, which is replacing the Christmas card, and you're giving a little bit of money, or you put something in the mission of, or you volunteer and turn up to help us run a cafe for the community during the week, or whatever it is that you do, and there's plenty of it that you do. What you're saying is, this is who our King is. This is what we do for our King, because this is what our King does for us. This is how we show our allegiance and our belonging and who we are. And what matters most is the truth that is God, the truth that God gives us in Christ. That's what matters, not the other stuff. That's what matters most. That's first. Herod, on the other hand, thinks that being top of the pile matters most. Herod thinks that an ambitious life matters most, where your ambitions are wealth, power, influence. Herod believes that it matters most to be strong in those senses, no matter what you have to do to be there, or who has to get hurt to get you there, and then to keep you there, because it feels very insecure once you're there. So they're immediately in contrast, the Magi and Herod. The Magi are excited about the idea that somebody's born King of the Jews. Herod is not excited. You may or may not know this, but part of his Roman title, and it's the Romans who are running the show, is Herod, King of the Jews. That's part of his formal title. And it was awarded to him specially for favors to Rome. So he has the official title in political life and national life as King of the Jews. And suddenly he's hearing, oh, somebody else has been born with that title. So his reaction, whereas the Magi want to welcome Jesus and to give him presents and to give him worship, Herod kills the children of Bethlehem and the area round about who could be within the age. It's as many as 20 kids, possibly. Or you may have thought it was more, or you may have thought it was less, I don't know. But based on the size of Bethlehem at the time, the kind of numbers that we're talking about, and there's 20 innocent children or thereabouts, are slaughtered. Herod would have said, if he lived today, oh, they're collateral damage. I was actually only bombing Jesus. They just happened to be in the way. We're sorry about it. We didn't. They just had to go in order that we make sure we hit the person we needed to hit, and so forth. So there's a big contrast between the Herod stuff and the Magi stuff. And here's the thing about the Magi, which Herod didn't discover, but the Magi did. Actually, Jesus isn't where you've been looking for him. Actually, you've kind of got the wrong end of the stick about who Jesus is. Every Christian disciple must face this fact. I learned the wrong stuff about Jesus. I didn't get it right. In fact, I'm still discovering who Jesus really is, and I'm still learning who Jesus really is. And what am I to do with the fact that I got some stuff wrong? And the answer is, follow the example of the Magi. They went to the palace where they expected to find him, but he wasn't there. He was out the back somewhere in Bethlehem, miles away, sleeping where the animals sleep, and so forth. That's where he was, or by the Magi's time, in somebody's house. But no, he's not in the palace. Oh, so he's not quite the king I thought he was. Well, no, he isn't. And each of us has to deal with that fact. But the Magi didn't say, oh, well, if he's not in the palace, we'll go home then. we're off. Let's give up on this. And they didn't say, oh, well, if he's actually got a couple of peasants for parents, and if actually he's in Bethlehem, which is after all not a very salubrious neighborhood, and, you know, if he's sort of tucked away, if they placed him in a manger on the day he was born, if he's kind of right down there, then we don't need to give him gold. We could give him silver. No, we don't need to give him silver. We could give him bronze. No, actually, we'll give him a W.H. Smith voucher or whatever it is. You know, we don't need to hit the high thing for this guy. He's just a peasant, it turns out. We could keep the gold. So don't do that. Don't go, oh, I'm not sure that Jesus is who I thought he was. I won't actually bother with him so much. And I won't give him what I could, because he's actually not quite what I was expecting. Rather say, nonetheless, we've seen the sign. He's the king. So even though it doesn't add up in my head, he's still to be visited, still to be worshipped, and still deserves the very best that we can give. So when you discover that Jesus isn't quite what you thought, because he isn't, right? We all have to relearn. It takes a whole heap of discovery to get what happens when God becomes a human being. And to understand that his kingdom, as he put it to Pilate, is not of this world. I'm not competing with Herod. I'll bless Herod. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's, but to God what's God's. I've come to help you give to God what belongs to God, and to make sense of your life and sense of your world, and give you worthwhile living and a worthwhile eternity too. I've come to give you the very best, and so forth. So don't downsize your response just because Jesus turns out different to what you thought. Let's have a quick think about shepherds. Might do a bit more of that nearer Christmas. But just contrast shepherds and Herod for a minute. They couldn't be more different, could they? Herod's got all the power. Shepherds, as you probably know, in Jesus' day, shepherds were right at the bottom of the social pile, right? You kind of didn't let them in the house if they came to visit. You know, you fed them out back or something. Shepherds were down at the bottom. Herod is right up at the top where there's power. Shepherds didn't even get to vote, right? They just didn't count for much. Herod lives his life guarded by guards. The shepherds are guarding their sheep. They're completely in just a totally different mode altogether. The king is guarded, Herod is guarded by others, but the shepherds are doing the guarding of those who are vulnerable. He's living life in the palace, they're out sleeping rough in order to do their guarding. He's still famous, and nobody knows how many shepherds there were, how many were men, how many were women, how many were children, because there will have been all three. Nobody knows any of their names or anything about them. They are in the world's eyes the nobodies, and Herod is the somebody. And God is saying to us in his gospel, actually, no. The shepherds are as much somebody as any famous person, as any celebrity, as any person who's ever held power, no matter how high up your pile you placed them. It means not a scratch to me. The shepherds are just as important, and the baby that is born has come as a human being for them, and their giving and their response is just as important as Herod's. Paul said this wonderful thing to the Corinthians, and he was talking about them. He was saying, by the way, remember who you are. If you kind of get in love with who's at the top of the pile and the celebrity status and what it would be if only you were wealthier, more powerful or whatever, so just remember who you are and so on. And when you were called, he said, not many of you in your church had any real status at all. He says this to them, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. You see, he chose the shepherds to shame the Herods. Yeah? Because that's what he always does, isn't it? This is the Jesus who, when his disciples were arguing about who should be the leader, took a little child and had the child stand in the middle and said, listen guys, you want to know about greatness? Will you stop telling the children to be like you and you learn to be like them? Understand that they're ahead of you. That you need to follow the example of the children. Otherwise you'll never get it. You won't understand how the kingdom works. You want to be great, be like the child. If you go, what? This is how God says it. Forget the Herods, be like a shepherd. Forget the grown-ups, be like the child. Get what matters, not what doesn't. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong, the lowly things of this world, and the despised. That's how the kingdom works. And that's why it's so great to be part of it. Well, to close, I want to finish by looking at Jesus. So let's do the contrast. Apologies to Herod, but he is the bad guy, and I'm saying it today. So the contrast between Herod and Jesus are pretty much like the contrast between Herod and the shepherds, only we'll look at them in terms of Jesus as king. So, yes, Herod's the guy in the palace where the Magi go looking. Jesus is the guy for whom there is no room. I can't even find an indoors place for his birth. Herod is lying down in his sort of fancy bed, whatever it might be, in his personally designed palace. Jesus is sleeping his first night on earth in a manger. His parents are subjects. Herod is the boss. So his parents are in Bethlehem because they've been told they have to go there by the people in power. Herod doesn't have to go anywhere. He's right in with the people with the most power. The people who gather round Jesus are people like shepherds. The people who gather round Herod are the elite, the rich, the powerful, the famous, etc. The only thing that they have in common really is the Magi. The Magi show up at both the palace and at the place in Bethlehem. But everything else is in contrast. Jesus comes into a faith-filled situation and people who are looking in faith to what God is unfolding. And Herod is at the top of the pile trying to stay there, and he's frankly insecure. He's scared rigid, and he kills anybody who gets in his way because he's so frightened. And Jesus is here to give life, and Herod tried to be king by destroying life. But Jesus says, no, that's not how God reigns. God's reign is completely different to that kind of system. God's reign is what Isaiah was talking about in your Christmas readings and carol services and so forth when you read from Isaiah, that he is the wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, a king of unlimited justice who makes righteous decisions on the behalf of the poor, etc. And he's the Son of God, as Mary and Joseph are repeatedly told, and others too. And God's kingship is based on these things: compassion, grace, patience, and love. That right throughout the Old Testament, when we need to know who God is, the prophets and the Old Testament writers take us back to this formula. It happens on many writers that God is the one who is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in grace love. Sometimes when people say to me, well, I don't believe in the religion stuff, I don't do religion, don't do the God thing, I wonder what God they're rejecting. I wonder what God it is they don't believe in. Because here's something that's dawned on me recently, and I'll leave with you. I think the God they don't believe in, I don't believe in either. The God who sits distant from the world, makes up some stupid rules that you can't live by anyway, and then punishes you if you don't keep them, or makes you feel bad that he loves you enough to come and die for your sin anyway. I think, no, that's really not the God of the Bible. And that's the God I think you're rejecting, because I think that's the God we've kind of told people is there. But actually the Bible tells us, no, God is the King of compassion, of justice, righteousness, in its deepest, most profound and godly sense. That he abounds in grace, and that is the nature of his love. And that's who God is. That's the God revealed to us in Jesus. It's a bit unexpected. It's a bit different to what we thought. But he is the King. King of the Jews in that sense, meaning not king of a political unit somewhere in what we would call the Middle East. But actually, that king promised the earth in the prophets who would arise from the people of the Jews and be the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. And I thank you, folks, for being people who are seeking the kingdom first, who are giving God a place such that you recognize his Son as your King, and you're on the business of trying to follow him, learn of him, love him, and serve him, belonging to him as the people of his kingdom. So, Lord, King of Kings, our Jesus born in Christmas, we do pray that you'd be born in our hearts today, that we would discover more of who you are, and that we'll go on loving the fact that your kingdom is so different and exactly what everybody needs. And we pray, Lord Jesus, to the King who didn't kill others, but rather gave up his own life for his enemies, who set aside the glories of heaven for the manger and for the cross. Risen Jesus, our King, it's you that we love, it's you that we're committed to. Strengthen that love and that commitment in us by the power of your Spirit, and lead us on in joy and freedom to serve you more and more, loving you more and more all the time. Thank you, King. Amen.